American Anti-Slavery Writings, Colonial Beginnings to Emancipation, is a 1,000-page collection of more than 200 texts in every genre: sermons, novels, poems, songs, children's books, essays, op-ed pieces, even great speeches that show how broadly slavery was reviled from the late 1600s all the way down through 1865, how much it was part of the collective consciousness of Americans over all that period, and how much literature, broadly defined, contributed to the change in attitude, the change in sensibility, the change in values that eventually brought political change, civil war, and an end to slavery in the United States. Behind every one of the 220 texts in this book is a story. But one of the most compelling stories to me is that of Saengil Sewell, who was a New England Puritan in the late 1600s and early 1700s. In fact, he had been a judge at the Salem witch trials, and he's the only one of those judges who later, 5 years later, publicly recanted. But Sewell was a man of conscience in more ways than one. Throughout his career as a minister and businessman in Boston, he supported American Indians and supported them on scholarships to be educated at local institutions. And he was, beginning in 1700, the first New Englander to be publicly outspoken against slavery. We know it from his private diaries, where he's confessing his anxiety about the inequality and the evil of bringing slaves from Africa in 1700. And then he publicly writes a pamphlet and publishes it, arguing from Scripture why slavery is absolutely wrong. So for me, he's one of the original American heroes. By the time of the American Revolution, anti-slavery writings had been in circulation for 3 generations. There were people writing against slavery in 1688, 1693, 1700, in New England, Virginia, and in between. What's startling for many people, I think, is to find Patrick Henry, Arthur Lee, both of them slave-owning Southerners, Virginians, American patriots, who are writing against slavery on moral grounds in the 1760s and 70s. But an important presence from the beginning are black writers and black people who, through their resistance and their testimony, are at the core of the anti-slavery movement from the absolute beginning. So one of the most important elements in the book are black writers, including 23 different slave narratives. We sometimes think there are only 2 or 3 famous ones. Well, yes, Frederick Douglass is here, although we don't quote from his narrative, but his other writings, but 23 other narratives, and we could have included scores more. But the important thing to say is that these slave narratives have a tremendous force, which apologists for slavery recognized from the beginning. And one of the driving efforts of opponents of the abolition movement was to try to discredit the slaves who wrote their narratives or testified about the awful, terrible, unspeakable conditions of slavery. They tried to discredit their writings and say, oh, well, they were too illiterate to write this, or some abolitionist must have ghostwritten this, or so on. That was a recurrent effort all the way down. And yet the sheer amassing of these compelling, horrifying, mesmerizingly terrible stories was perhaps the prevailing evidence that tipped the balance in the long term. They simply couldn't be refuted. You could say that Harriet Beecher Stowe had just written a novel. It's all fiction, Uncle Tom's Cabin. But you couldn't say that about countless slave narratives from Olaudah Equiano and Frederick Douglass on down. I've been a classroom teacher for 30 years in community college, undergraduates, graduate students, and in my summer programs with high school students, thousands of them. And so inevitably I thought of this book in my inner mind as a teaching book, as a book where every text in it should be useful to teachers, and teachers in every subject and at all levels. The first thing is to capture students' imaginations. Well, there's so many ways to do that with material here. Who knew that there was a petition from a Virginia anti-slavery society in 1791 presented to the American Congress? What does that do to our thinking about the founding era? Who knew that there were these radical Christians speaking out against slavery in the early 1700s in uncompromising voices to their whole congregation, and then in printed form beyond that? But there are also texts that would be good even in elementary schools. There are children's books, children's stories, and even an alphabet for beginning readers. One of my favorite pieces of all, every letter of the alphabet is there with a 4-line poem that beginning readers could recite, and every single poem has an anti-slavery message in it for elementary school kids, or for kids just beginning to read, and other pieces for children. You can see how far the world has changed in 3 centuries. I mean, the world we live in the 21st century, is a universal assumption that every person's natural right is to freedom and to a certain quality of life. That was nowhere the assumption 400 years ago. And so we have come a long way. It's a very dramatic story. It's a painful story because it was slow and came in fits and starts and with terrible opposition at times. But it did come. And that's the story that this book tries to contribute to.